A South Korean team of officials is currently in neighboring Japan for an on-site survey of Tokyo's plans to discharge radioactive wastewater from its crippled Fukushima nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean starting this summer. So what is the Korean team's agenda in Japan? Do these independent surveys look to ease mounting concerns? And are there any alternatives to better tackling the Fukushima radioactive wastewater? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. In this edition, we touch upon efforts by a South Korean delegation over in Fukushima today to inspect its radioactive wastewater. For more on this, I have Dr. Tilman Ruff, founding chair of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, live on the line. Dr. Ruff, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Many thanks for having me, Sunny.
I also have Kwon Soa here in the studio, so welcome back.
Hello, Sunny.
Right, so let's begin with a few details then about Japan's planned discharge of its Fukushima radioactive wastewater.
More than 1 million tons of wastewater from the devastated Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant are planned to be released into the Pacific Ocean. And Japan has been predicting this should start happening in spring or summer this year. Now, just a week left of May, so it's more likely to begin in summer if everything goes as Tokyo plans. Tokyo Electric Power Company, which is responsible for dealing with the crippled plant, says the process of releasing what it calls treated water is necessary for the decommissioning process and has gotten the approval from the Japanese government. Before getting into the reason for Japan's plan, let me take you briefly back to the 2011 disaster. March 11, 2011 was the day Japan was hit by a massive nuclear accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant following a devastating earthquake and tsunami. The plant's cooling systems were destroyed, leading to 3 reactors to melt and leak large amounts of radioactive materials. Ever since then, Japan has been struggling to handle the contaminated water for 12 years. The more than 1,000 tanks storing treated and diluted water or wastewater, TEPCO says, are 97% full. And it's a combination of groundwater, rainwater, and seawater that has accumulated with the cooling water over the years. So the tanks are full. Japan wants to prevent the risk of another leak in case of a natural disaster like an earthquake or tsunami again. Also, they need the space for an even tougher task ahead regarding melted debris. So how is the discharge going to work? Japan plans to release the water via an undersea tunnel after radioactive materials are removed through the Advanced Liquid Processing System, or ALPS. The discharge is estimated to take some 4 decades.
Right, I see. This past Sunday, Korea dispatched its own delegation with inspectors to better assess Japan's upcoming release. Could you tell us a bit about the team and its mission there?
Right. I just laid out Japan's plan of its water release, but I didn't mention the safety concerns, which are immense, though, especially among countries that share the waters and that could potentially be affected by the dumping of the wastewater from Japan. Now, despite the Japanese government's continuous statements assuring the safety of the process, claiming the release meets international standards and won't cause any harm to the environment, for Korea, this, as well as the inspections of the International Atomic Energy Agency, was not enough to assure the safety of the nation's people in the coming years, especially in terms of the consumption of seafood. One concern that's been mentioned frequently is the concentration of tritium, a radioactive form of hydrogen that cannot be removed from the wastewater before being let go into the ocean. Now, Japan therefore gave the green light to a South Korean inspection team to visit the Fukushima nuclear power plant to examine the processes being made. And this agreement came during the recent South Korea-Japan summit between President Yoon Suk-yeol and his counterpart Fumio Kishida. So a 21-member team arrived in Japan on Sunday for a 6-day trip. Now, yesterday on Monday, they kicked off official activities. It was mostly a meeting with officials from TEPCO, Japanese government officials, and the country's top nuclear regulator, the Nuclear Regulation Authority, for a briefing on details of the water discharge plan. And the actual on-site inspections are taking place today, Tuesday, and tomorrow. And on Thursday, in-depth discussions are scheduled based on the South Korean delegation's inspections. The gist during the review will be the examination of ALPS, the purification system I mentioned before. Now, Yoo Ki, Nuclear Safety and Security Commission chairperson who leads South Korea's delegation, told reporters on Monday that his team will check the system to assess the safety of the treated water and also check the K4 tanks, which store and measure radioactive substances with their own eyes, and that they will also request necessary data from Japanese authorities. Now, along with you, the team, meanwhile, is comprised of 19 experts from the Korea Institute of Nuclear Safety and one from the Korea Institute of Oceans Science and Technology. Japan had refused the visit of South Korean private experts, saying that this inspection is a government-to-government matter.
Right, and staying with that, Dr. Ruff, the Korean delegation, as Soa mentioned, does not include civilian experts, and nor will it be able to collect samples of the wastewater. How do you respond?
My concern about this delegation, as with previous delegations that have visited from Taiwan, from the Pacific Island Forum, is that essentially the way that the Japanese government and TEPCO are portraying these visits are different from a comprehensive scientific independent evaluation. They really seem largely intended to reassure, provide limited access, limited public information, and limited findings on how well the purification system that they have established for the wastewater works. That's not something that one can measure as a one-off occasion at any particular time. That requires comprehensive results over a long period of time as to how the system is working. And so far, the level of transparency and timeliness of the results that have been made available have been, to be frank, concerningly limited. And so I'm really worried about the level of access and really whether this will really be able to conduct a thorough investigation to establish the safety of the process that's planned.
Right, and before we go any further, Dr. Ruff just mentioned the team from Taiwan and the Pacific Island Forum. Could you tell us a bit more about those two earlier efforts to assess Japan's planned discharge?
Sure, Sunny. South Korea is not the only country in the region that has expressed concerns ever since Japan's announcement to release the wastewater this year. So the actual announcement came in April 2021, but earlier this year was when Japan actually provided that rough timeline of either spring or summer. Taiwan, for instance, had a 8-member inspection team sent in March last year, and this visit was accepted mainly due to Taiwan not being a member of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And later, there was another trip done in November by Taiwan, but this was more related to the lifting of seafood import bans the month before, so a checkup trip related to that. So you might be asking yourself, why did Taiwan just, lift import restrictions regarding seafood, while earlier they went to inspect the site because of concerns of the wastewater release. So this is actually a kind of political matter because Taiwan is looking for a membership at the CPTPP, which is a multilateral trade pact. So the gist is, I just want to mention that the second trip does not really have much to do with the first trip, I believe, although it is said that Taiwan has made a number of trips, inspection trips to Japan. But also I want to mention the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, which also had experts make a visit in February earlier this year, that being the PIF in short, which is an intergovernmental organization that's meant to enhance cooperation between countries and territories of Oceania. So both the Taiwan and PIF team were briefed by TEPCO and government authorities in Japan, and they inspected the K4 tanks, the ALPS system, and undersea tunnel. So not that much different from what the South Korean delegation is doing right now in Japan. So doubts also remained after the trip of Taiwan and the PIF, and that's why the PIF has also recommended Korea to request samples of the water treated by the ALPS system, which, however, as we know, won't be the case. Meanwhile, an inaugural South Korea Pacific Islands Summit is slated to be held next week, where Japan's planned wastewater release is expected to be on the agenda. So many countries in the region are probably going to also ask South Korea about their recent trip.
Right, and staying with that, Dr. Ruff, following its mission, the Pacific Island Forum reportedly proposed several alternatives to Japan, including the possible use of the wastewater to make concrete. Is this a viable option?
Yes, I think it is. And I think the process that the Pacific Islands Forum has engaged in this process is really commendable. They engaged a 5-person team of independent international experts from the United States, including some very respected marine scientists, nuclear physicists, people with different expertise from Australia, from Hawaii. And they met repeatedly with the Japanese government and TEPCO, as you mentioned, as well as with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and produced, to my knowledge, the only accessible independent report. And they were really scathing about the lack of adequate data to reassure this current plan that it was reasonable to proceed. And they were also rather scathing about the lack that they feel had been given to really viable alternatives that also expert groups in Japan have put forward. Radioactive elements decay over time. If the water was stored rather longer, instead of in these hastily built tanks cobbled together really under great duress at short notice, not designed for long-term storage, but the kind of tanks that are used, for example, for Japan's National Petroleum Reserve, seismically safe tanks built for the long term. If the water was stored for several decades and then released, then the radioactivity would be much less. The radioactivity would also be much less if, as the Pacific Island Scientific Panel recommended, that treated water were then used to make concrete for structural applications, for road foundations, for building foundations, for bridges and so forth, where the contact with humans and also other plants and animals would be very limited. And the beta radiation, which is one of the concerning forms of radiation that's emitted by those substances, would be contained within the concrete. A number of other alternatives have been proposed using bioremediation, using organisms like algae and various crustaceans that concentrate particular isotopes, and reducing the water volume through evaporation or some combination of those. As I understand it, and certainly as the Pacific Scientific Panel has recommended, none of these other alternatives have really been seriously explored. They would essentially avoid the transboundary and transgenerational hazards of simply releasing large volumes of radioactive material into the environment, where it will travel with ocean currents, it will concentrate in the food chain, it will be deposited in sediments, and really cause widespread and long-term radioactive pollution.
Right. Dr. Ruff, what potential information do you think shared by Japan could serve to perhaps allay regional safety concerns then?
Well, I think if Japan had really fully and comprehensively and transparently considered the alternatives, the risks and the benefits of the multiple possible approaches, and really laid out an open evidence-based process for making that decision, with ample evidence about what exactly is to be released. We don't actually know how much radioactivity will be released, and we don't know yet how well the purification system, this ALPS system, works. On the basis of what's available now publicly, there has been very limited sampling with many periods of time up to a year where no results have been provided, for example, to the Pacific Islands Forum team. So we simply don't know what is there, and the evidence that is available is that the system hasn't worked as intended. TEPCO and the IAEA have said, well, then the water will simply be put through the system repeatedly. But before one embarks on such a major enterprise with consequences for all of the countries that border the Pacific and are located within it, the effectiveness of the system and exactly how it will work really needs to be established transparently for all to see well before the process is embarked on, not just prior to discharge when any preventive approaches or corrective approaches are essentially then impossible. It's too late.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, against that backdrop, so here on the local front, the ruling People Power Party recently invited a physics scholar to share his thoughts with regard to Japan's plans. Could you tell us a bit about his stance?
If I had the chance, I would drink 10 liters of Fukushima water. That's the controversial statement made by Professor Emeritus of Oxford University, Wade Allison, who was invited for a lecture at a task force meeting by the ruling People Power Party at the National Assembly recently. That's the Protection of Our Sea Verification Task Force. And the professor there claimed that the safety concerns regarding the Fukushima plant are exaggerated. So here are some more of his quotes. "There is no difference between Fukushima seafood and Korean products. This water needs to be discharged sooner. Tritium is not a problem for the human body at all." He furthermore explained that he can't think of a particular effect from wastewater that could do more harm than when getting a CT scan or medical X-ray scan. So with these statements having been made just ahead of the Korean inspection team's dispatch to Japan, there were some fierce debates growing among politicians, with the main opposition Democratic Party calling on the canceling of the on-site inspection, with concerns the Yoon administration is trying to jointly defend or justify the Japanese government with its water release.
Right, and Dr. Ruff, simply speaking, what are your thoughts on the wisdom of drinking, quote, treated radioactive wastewater from the crippled Fukushima nuclear power plant?
Well, with all due respect, I don't know Professor Allison. I understand that his expertise is in physics, not in health. But a number of the views that he espoused then are really not in line with the evidence or with recommendations of respected national and international authorities that deal with radiation protection. And it would be unwise for anybody, as the professor mentioned, to be exposed to additional avoidable radiation, however it comes, whether for medical purposes or from environmental contamination or in any other way. Every increment of radiation that one might be exposed to does cause biological harm, and there's no level below which one can say there is no effect. So exposures of all types, medical or otherwise, should be minimised as much as possible. Certainly knowingly drinking radioactively contaminated material is unwise.
Right, and Dr. Ruff, the technical term, the jargon, tritium, has been thrown around quite a bit amid concerns of the Fukushima radioactive wastewater. What is it, and is it harmful?
Yes, it is. It's one of the many hundreds of radioactive substances that behave in different ways, that are radioactive for different periods of time, that are produced inside a nuclear reactor or a nuclear bomb. It's one of those. It's a slightly heavier form of hydrogen, which is one of the most common elements, the lightest element. And it is the largest discharge of any radioactive substance from routinely operating nuclear plants. An excellent review on tritium's biological effects, researching all of the known literature, was just published last month. And that evidence shows very clearly that in all biological systems that were studied, plants, animals, bacteria, various larval forms of fish and a wide variety of organisms, tritium has biological effects that are about at least twice as harmful for the same amount of energy delivered as is caused by X-rays. So tritium is certainly a biological hazard. Because it has a half-life of 12 years, so that means every 12 years it decays by half, which is intermediate in radioactive terms, because it emits radiation that doesn't travel very far and isn't very highly penetrating. And because it is widely released by normally operating nuclear facilities, it's often considered relatively benign. But that radiation, which is not very penetrating, it won't penetrate your skin if it's outside your body. But the problem is when it's ingested, when it's taken in with food or water or inhaled, and comes in very close proximity to cells within the body. Then its hazard is is, as I mentioned, at least double that of normal X-rays or gamma rays. Every radioactive substance that releases radioactivity that people are exposed to causes a long-term increased risk of cancer and various other chronic diseases for the life of that exposed person, and tritium is no different.
And Dr. Ruff, one final question with regard to tritium. Very briefly speaking, what do scientists mean when they claim it may be more harmful to consume tritium through the food chain than through water?
Yes, this is a very important factor. I'm glad you brought that up, Sunny, in relation to environmental discharges of radioactive materials, because many of them concentrate in particular areas like sediments in the sea, and they also accumulate within organisms. And so they concentrate up the food chain, so that the concentration in particularly large fish that are prized for eating, like tuna, at the top of the food chain, maybe tens or hundreds or in some cases even thousands of times higher than the levels of the plankton at the bottom of the food chain or the water that those fish are swimming in. So if people then eat that seafood, then they will be exposed to much more radioactive material than if they were just simply exposed to the water that those fish were in. The second particular reason why eating tritium in organic material, food and liquid, is biologically significant, apart from that you will get a larger dose if it's concentrated up the food chain, is that organically bound tritium, because chemically it acts essentially just like water, it becomes incorporated in water, but that hydrogen may also become incorporated into proteins and DNA and other important molecules in biological organisms. And so once it's organically bound, that tritium has a much longer residence time in our body and is much more likely to cause localized irradiation to cells that it gets inside. So for those two reasons, ingestion of tritium in foodstuffs is more significant a source of exposure than being exposed to it in the external environment or drinking it in water.
And hence the concerns with regard to Japan's planned discharge of radioactive wastewater into the Pacific Ocean, probably starting this summer then. All right, Professor Ruff, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
My thanks for having me.
And so, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. We return same time tomorrow, that is Wednesday, so do join us then.